Today we gotta talk about something different. We gotta talk about at the moment of 2022. We gotta talk about the Spanish-speaking world, mainly Latin America. If people don't know, half, almost half of the Spanish-speaking countries of Latin America have voted for socialist presidents. For some people, that's a good thing. If you don't understand what the video is going with, this image is a good example. This image is called Somia. It is a geographical location, a geographical term of multiple ethnic and racial groups and indigenous groups throughout this region. It is the size of Europe with a population of 100 million people. And this is the largest anarchist society in the world and it's been around for 2000 years. Este, this is not intentional. This is an organized structure that had developed over time with a consistency against state authority and centralized power. Why I'm showing you this? Because in Latin America, the Spanish-speaking countries, like I said, half of them voted for socialist presidents. People think that's a good thing, which at the surface, yes, and to some extent, I support them. But the problem is they assume that a state power is a good thing to achieve socialism. We have shown historically that no matter how revolutionary your politics and your philosophy, it will fail if you put hierarchical centralized state power as the basis for your politics because it becomes corrupt and becomes reactionary. I will read multiple articles what's going on in the Spanish speaking world where these socialist presidents are winning. Sadly, I couldn't focus much about the Caribbean because, with the exception of Cuba, of course, most of the Caribbean islands do not have a socialist president. Some of them are socialist by technicality, like social democrats, but that's not really the point. And most of these Caribbean islands, the government is too weak to do anything, and the usual corruption here and there. But the Caribbean history has the least problematic history when it comes to post independence or after the 19th century, where barely anything bad happens in the Caribbean, with the exception of the Spanish Caribbean, Haiti, and Jamaica, and Grenada. With the exception of those islands, the rest of the Caribbean is very peaceful with little to no topic, with the occasion maybe one or two massacres, one coup in Trinidad and Tobago, and pretty much that's about it. Like seriously, it's like nothing really happens outside the Spanish-speaking islands and Haiti and Jamaica and Grenada. So the problem is many of these socialist presidents becoming using state power become problematic because they just assume that you need that and becomes corrupt and becomes unstable. One example is Peru, where Pedro Castillo, the new president from the who is a self-declared communist, economically speaking, he is a Marxist. He wants the nationalization of the means of production, which the problem is when I made the video critique against Marxism, nationalization is no different than privatization. You just replace one boss with another. And when it comes to social issues, he's pretty far right about it. He is against abortion and many of the feminist ideals that people were fighting for, and he's against them. And now he's in power, he will prevent those things to happen unless people push enough, to convince them to otherwise. But I doubt. Another problem is Bolivia. After the U.S. attempted coup in Bolivia, putting Evo Morales, the first indigenous president of Bolivia, replaced a new one. The new president, when it showed vaccines, had to be Johnson & Johnson, and they're using patents which prevent people to have the necessary need to be vaccinated for the disease, and he doesn't push them to unpatent them because copyright equals money, and endangers the lives of the people. And this is even worse because este, I don't know how I say it, but I know someone who works at Johnson & Johnson, and let's be honest, their bureaucracy is shit. They're very incompetent, that's all I had to say. So they involve in colonialism of the medicine where people do not access to it because they need to buy a certain patent, and like for fuck's sake, and the president doesn't do anything about it, and the people try to protest otherwise. But like I said, he using the neoliberal model, and and he's working. The new president of Bolivia, who's supposed to be a socialist, is making programs and funded by the World Bank, for example, and the International Monetary Fund. So it becomes a struggle for the people, especially the workers who want increased wages and other things. But for now, he is doing nothing that actually helps the people. There are many articles that I will recommend that will focus about each Latin American Spanish speaking country that has a socialist president. I already talked about Peru and Bolivia, so we gotta talk about each perspective one, right? And it's not gonna be easy because some articles are very long and some don't. Let's start with Cuba because it's the most well known of the socialist countries in the Spanish speaking world. It was a interview with Gustavo Rodriguez and talking about the protest, the yellow rebellion of Cuba, what happened in Cuba. Anarchists look at the 11J protests. And I will read from here on out. These days, we have received a thorough statement generated in the mass disinformation media about the recent protests in Cuba. On the one hand, there are those formulated by the Cuban officialdom and the leftists of the world in the same of the anti-imperialists and in defense of what they still call the Cuban Revolution, quote unquote. On the other hand, there are traditional right-wing media that accuse the communist dictatorship of the lack of freedom and rights. The Communist Party of Cuba and its international acolytes call for the solidarity with the regime, arguing they are facing a new intervention of the Yankee imperialism, which is taking advantage of the disastrous economic condition caused by more than 60 years of blockade and the greatest health crisis in its history. While the support of the free market and the right-wing forces claim that it was happening in the country to resolve its citizens' oppression due to the lack of opportunities in the socialist regime. In these times of the post-truth, we are suspicious of all these positions, but also as anarchists, we are not only suspicious of these channels of manipulation, but we identify positions that are contrary to our practice and enemies of desire for total liberation. Unfortunately, the information we have received so far with clear anarchist position from the territory controlled by the Cuban state is minimal. That is why we choose to interview an anarchist voice from which we identify and ask him to share with us his perspective of the fact what his experience and an exile of Cuban origin. In order to be better understand what is happening in Cuba, from Anica Info AI, we have always given to the reflection of our comrade Gustavo Rodriguez, hosting our blog almost all of the contribution on the informal anarchist tendency and the development of contemporary insurrectional anarchism, reaffirming the black path for anarchy and promotion permanent insurrection from the international conspiracy that coincide the black international in our days. And right now, Cuba, people often forget the discrimination against black Cubans, the police brutality against people, and the arrest of LGBT people who are still criminalized by basically the state. So, what is happening in Cuba? And the immense pleasure is mine. First of all, I would like to thank you for a long time now to promptly hosting and dismantling my contribution on your website. I also thank you for the opportunity to expose my views on the Cuban situation. However, I declare myself incompetent to answer your first question in only extension its demands. However, this plea does not arise from the impossibility of being presented in the country and or not having participated in the struggle. If there are those who have been unable to take the pulse of the insurrectional moment they are living. But the vast diversity of perspectives generated by these events from many different points of view, including the different lenses that I, in one way or another, claim to be libertarianism and insular anarchism. Undoubtedly, I can transmit you a balance of the fact for other related reflection of comrades in situ, and I will also share with you my perspective from my experience as an exile of that singular banana National Socialism, and for more than 6 decades reign with blood and fire of the largest Antilles. In that sense, I can assert that the last July 11, there was an unprecedented social outburst, with the president in all 16 provinces, of course. According to the narrative of the Cuban dictatorship, this social explosion never occurred, but rather there were attempts at public disorder and riots instigated by vandals, delinquents, and antisocial elements belonging to the most vulgar and indecent sectors of society, and manipulated by the cyber war orchestrated by the empire. Evidently, what is happening in Cuba is that a deeply rebellious generation that has lost its fear, despite the omnipresent control of the repressive mechanism, has gained prominence. It has happened that the 6 decades of authoritarian epidemic was added to the COVID pandemic, which is nightly curfew and sanitary encirclements. It happens. In the myth of the revolution with the capital letters is over and the grammar and the socialist paradise, quote unquote, is exhausted. Evidence of the enormous inequality gap generated by the ruling class in the name of communism. It happens if the deep classism and acute racism of the political elites come to light beyond the egalitarian rhetoric and discursive demagogy. And it happens during the protest. The National Socialist state took off its mask, revealing its true face, which is not all different from the repressive role of the Chilean, Colombian, American, or any other state. As the cruel revolt of the last year showed, as anticipated by Ramon Castilla Guerra, thousands of people were arrested during the demonstration and half a thousand are still in prison, some of them minors, such as Marcos Antonio Perez Fernandez, under the accusation of contempt, insulting the president, demanding property, and spreading contagion. Among other charges, it happens that there are about 20 disappeared and dozens of people wounded by firearms, exclusive use of repressive force, and hundreds of women men severely beaten by civilian and ununiformed agents. It happened to the young Afro-Cuban Tibers Laurencio Tejeda. It was cowardly assassinated by the regime's henchmen. It happens that for the first time, hundreds of young people from the poor neighborhoods and marginal strips, those who put their chests on the front line in Oaxaca, Santiago de Chile, or Portland, and promote subversive indiscipline and propagating illegalism, living daily anarchy beyond the classic classes, discord rhetoric and politically correct verbiage, respond to the bullet with stone. They overturn patrol cars, expropriate supermarket, and control the agents of repression hand to hand. So, what originated the protest? Sickness and the racial hopelessness have been the origin of this protest, as the rest of the planet, which highlight the absurdity of the Cuban exceptionality. The international left from social democrat to postmodern Leninism is racing, weeding all the discursive demagogy of the dictatorship with its whole story of medical excellence, the greatness of the educational system, and the high human development index, and medical excellence, all the oratory for external consumption, which in reality is far from the official quibble, with hospital without doctors or beds and health centers or polyclinics, lacking hygiene and running water, of course, not to mention the lack of ambulances, one for every 10 patrol cars, and the constant shortage of medicine. This is a sharp contrast to the juicy export of human capital through the Lyncea medical brigades and international mission, one of the main sources of income of the economy, and the incidents providing dollars by the lucrative medical tourism, surpassed only by sex tourism. Sorry, I meant leisure tourism, second source of foreign currency of the regime, and the sending of remedies from Miami, an educational greatness that in fact is reflected in insufficient teachers and the growing desertion of young people between 15 and 16 years of age in the high school levels, and an HDI that have practiced, leaving aside the official figures historically made up, translate into one of the countries in Latin America with the highest suicide rate among adolescents and young people. However, it should be pointed that under underlying tone of the protest was not the demand for solutions for the shortage of all kinds of medicine, or the poor conditions of hospital, or the criminal increase in the prices of basic foods, or the lack of housing and the precarity of buildings, while Gaesa builds thousands of luxury hotels, marinas, and golf courses, and also the increase of free market neoliberalism and the US dollar created the wealth gap, much less the lack of teachers, but the resounding demand for freedom and the anonymous cry to demand loudly down with the dictatorship. As John Comrade recently commented from Havana, we do not ask the state for a solution because we know the state is the problem. And he adds, we have to look for solution in the garbage because that is what the state is, garbage. So who participated the protest? As I could see multiple videos that were transmitted live during the protest, and as confirmed by friends who I am with in contact, the participation was varied. The people from all strata political position, including apolitical ones, highlight in the significant way of the intervention of young people. Particularly extensive was the presence of the poor sector, those excluded from the system, where the Afro-Cuban population stand out in the preparatory way. It's not by chance that the majority of the prison system, in contrast with its reduced representative in the dominant elite. As for the coordination of the protest, it's worth noting it was the great abstain. There was no call whatsoever, neither in the social network nor throughout the word of mouth, in the cachitas and the jail. It was spontaneous explosion, so spontaneous that not only took by surprise the different opposing group, but also the whole framework of repression surveillance. Despite the thick alphabetic soup, the multiple groups that had their letters, the mechanical control system, leaving the network or informers a sophisticated listening system of the dictatorship in a very bad shape. The only thing that helped the extension of the prototype was the dissemination of the mobilization in real time through digital platforms and the networks of virtual link, which allowed in a matter of minutes that the anti-systematic demonstration originated in the municipality of San Antonio de los Baños, which is, 31 kilometers from the city of Havana, to be replicated almost simultaneously. This caused the Vienna cake of several floors that separate by means of a dense general grievance at the multiple layers of the Cuban social cake until reaching the top floor where the royal family and the first circle of the privileged dwell to wobble. However, it cannot be ignored that the success of the surprise factors reside in the confines of the oligarchy in its sophisticated system of surveillance and repression, and above all, the secure offer by having implanted fear and insular paranoia in a wide sector of society. This acts as a villages allowed for years for the local oligarchy and its acolytes, as well as a wide range of opportunists who enjoy benefiting and perks, to live it as true foreigners in their country, who have prevented them from feeling the accumulated weariness and rage of hopelessness. Much less they have the capacity to foresee the coming insurrection. So, has the blockade play any role in this? Before answering this question, I must emphasize the need to dismantle certain Manichaeism, completely alien to anarchist practices, which is inescapable, have placed our tenants in the every time the criticism of Cuba, Venezuela, or Nicaragua dictatorship is addressed, their surface from the deepest recesses, as if from anarchism there is something to rescue for these states in particular. The strange libertarian posture always constrains us to take sides, deliberately forgetting that anarchists, by our very essence, do not take the side of any state, at least we should not. Of course, it is not the first time nor will be the last time the so-called anarchists take side in these state disputes and demand the secession of sanctioned by one state against another, or failing that demand the secession sanctioned by one state against another, or failing that demand the secession, the tightening of sanctions, embargoes, and blockades. It was the case of those who, from anarchist position, energetically supported the international embargo on South Africa, without paying much attention to the probable damage with the lack of oil and the subsequent paralysis of its economy would cause the population, but just intention of putting an end to the apartheid imposed by a proletariat dictatorship. Something similar had already happened after the fascist coup of General Franco, with the pressure of the representative of Spanish and narco-syndicalists exile in Mexico. Some of them were of the so-called government exile, so that the Mexican state would prevent the admission of Spain of the nascent UN, since Franco dictatorship had been established with the military cooperation of foreign states. These pressures of the democratic governments of the world demand the isolation of Spain, a sort of, blockade. A strategy with the beginning of the 1960s motivated the libertarian syndicalists to visit some country of the so-called socialist camp, highlighting the negotiation with the former Yugoslavia and Cuba. The latter not only did not break off relations with the caudillo, but also strengthened them. The idol between the two caudillos became so strong that in order of the now stone commander-in-chief, the Cuban state declared national mourning upon the death of the tyrant of all people. Having expressed the above, I must now clarify, giving the benefit of the doubt to some comrade the term blockade. In the case that concerns, we must always place the grammar of the dictatorship at the panegyric discourse of the henchmen, inside and outside the island. Of course, I hope with this statement I will not accuse of supporting Washington's sanction against Cuba's state, although I must confess that at this stage of my life it is not an issue that keeps me awake at night, but I consider it unacceptable to continue playing the game of the regime and not calling things by their name. In this regard, it's worth remembering the imperialist blockade is an undeniable fact of history, which took place 30 days in October 1962 of the missile crisis. In the context of the confrontation between the two imperial powers during the Cold War, when Kennedy ordered the literal blockade of Cuba, created a sledge with his naval fleet, increasing the troop planes south of Florida in the Guantanamo base. After the Kennedy-Khrushchev Pact, when the agreement not to invade Cuba was settled, the blockade was ended and the initial posture was returned to, that is to say, the economic embargo imposed on February 7, 1962, which prohibited the importation of all merchandise of Cuban origin into U.S. territory, which reinforced the embargo on October 19, 1960, implemented by President Eisenhower after the nationalization of U.S. companies in Cuba for a value of $1 billion, which prevented U.S. export to Cuba except medicine and foodstuffs. And during Bill Clinton's administration, the Cuban Democracy Act of 1992 and the Cuban Liberty and Democracy Solidarity Act of 1996 extended the embargo extrajudicially, prohibited U.S. subsidies in third world countries from trading with the Cuban state, which intensified political hostility against the Castro dictatorship. To these sanctions, the government of Joe Biden recently added the Cuban state, which intensified political hostility against, the freezing of accounts as set under U.S. jurisdiction and the prohibit of visa to travel to the United States, and the director of the National Revolutionary Police, Oscar Alejandro Gaellas Valcarce, and Eddie Manuel Sierra Aria, within the framework of the Magnitsky Act. After a long peroration by a way historical account, it only remains for me to inform those comrades who, out of ignorance, repeat the propaganda of the regime to the point of exhausted. The United States is among the 20 main commercial partners of the Cuban state, being the largest supplier of red meat, frozen turkey and chicken, cereals, powdered milk, perishable food, herbicide, medicine, and medical supplies for humanitarian purposes, including ultrasound equipment, laboratory reagents, cannulas, prostates, among others. Therefore, when ordinary Cubans, not the oligarchy, nor the privilege of the regime, nor the opportunists who swore in different Cuban institutions, talk about blockade, we're invariably referred to one implemented by the dictatorship of more than 60 years. And yes, the internal blockades play a determined role in the aggravation of the cause that provoked these protests. The other, the imperialist blockade, has been a regime's resort par excellence to test the periculousness of the exclusive sector and to impose surveillance and repression against any son or daughter of the neighbor. You see the label of which Hitler insulted the Jews worms within the framework of the eternal anathema. Overall, the government is in shaking hands right now because the people realize the state does not work, and the government are using every emergency measure to please the miserable people. And protests in prison acknowledge the racism against Afro-Cubans because the majority of the prison population are Afro-Cubans who in general did not commit any crime whatsoever. And this has been ignored mainly by Black Lives Matter, the movement of Black Lives Matter, to understand this. Honduras isn't any better, despite the new socialist president, and still relies the same neoliberal policies, and still has ties with the U.S. government who did a coup in 2009, and they still have over 500 or at least 600 military bases in the U.S. in Honduras. And for now, there is no revolutionary member. Despite people praising the new election, they still have problems to go with the same economic policies of neoliberalism, his ties with U.S. military bases, and the lack of support of the indigenous people throughout Latin America. And the United States, like they did in 2009 with the coup, is to wear down any radical movements because their strategy is, how do I say this? Wear out any moderate, that's considered radical for the United States, and seek international, help, which gotta be the World Bank and International Monetary Fund or other similar example, and whether or not the CIA or FBI or whatever, the Pentagon or whatever the United States decide to do, use any excuse, either not militarily but economic means and policy wise. And Chile, despite the new president of Chile, the youngest president in history, supports land back, it still had a lot of problems against the indigenous people, especially the Mapuche people. Like, for example, in the article by Crime Inc., Chile, the hot potato changed hands, but what does electoral video for the lab mean for the autonomous movement? Voters across Chile delegate to attend the convention that will compose a new constitution of the country. The right wing was sadly defeated in this election, but no institutional left party gained a majority either. The corporate media are highlighting this as a victory for independent politics, but what would this mean for the autonomous movement that gave the left politicians movement momentum in the first place? On the following analysis, our correspondent in Chile explored the irresponsible tension between the politics of repression, the politics of direct action. And remember, The Argentinian and Chile, which is the leftist socialist one at the moment with the president, declared state of emergency and basically an unofficial, undeclared war against the Mapuche people who just want their land back, because the Mapuche people are the only indigenous tribe or indigenous group in South American history that never surrendered. Actually, they never lost against the conquistadors, so they never lost their land to begin with. The same thing with the Seminoles in the United States, and the same thing with the Cuban Tainos. So and all of them were anarchist societies, so there you go. The editorial video of the non-constitutional left in Chile is the latest development of the story that had been going on for years, from the Pink Tide, to brought left politicians like Luis Inácio Lula da Silva to power in Brazil, to victory of Syriza in Greece following the movement of 2011. In each of these cases, the failure of right-wing and centrist politics paved the way for these electoral victories, but left party has struggled to deliver on their promises, and even more extreme right-wing politicians have succeeded them, Bolsonaro in Chile and New Democracy in Greece. How can horizontal social movement navigate the situation arise from left electoral victories so as to ensure that their prosper are not tied to the fate of political parties and government? Chile has a history of right-wing anti-government direct action with further complicated matters. In an area when the state power is like a hot potato that can burn whoever holds it, and even a moment when seat to be ruling over has been defeated, which look into the future prepare for the next round. And the people protested against the election to begin with, and the neighborhood assemblies and social organizations have participated in these elections emphasize three principles. They want to see a sample like in Venezuela, where you have indigenous community making their own anarchist society communes separate from Venezuela, with a contradiction where the money is controlled by the National Bank of Venezuela, or Bolivia, allowed to the second largest city to function under anarchist principle, criticizes the Bolivian government of their neoliberal policies. The example of the Chilean people is popular sovereignty, which should take place in the interest of the everyday Chilean and not the politicians, regardless if it's left or right. Popular power, the politicians should represent the interests of social movement, the non-constitutional organization via which everyday Chileans articulate their social demands. Territorial autonomy, change the centralized political system that gives far more power to the national government at the cost of local municipality, the immediate connection to everyday Chileans. And since the referendum, political party and social organization compile lists of candidates and campaign for these elections. Social organizations have opportunity to act like a political party, create their own electoral slate for the constitutional convention, and holding their own primary to choose mayoral candidates. The right wing for sure was they will gain the full 1/3 vote that needed to obtain veto power in the constitutional convention. The Secretary of State, James Bellono, asserted the election to determine who will participate in the process to establish a new Chilean constitution. And for the most part, and this is before the election was over when they did this result, but the Independientes are practically the largest one. Which is like 48 seats, I think it was, if I'm not mistaken. So far, no political party has any mass social movement with the Chilean people, and Chilean people are becoming more decentralized and horizontal over time, which is a good thing because it will fight against state power if they do anything that goes against the people, like women's autonomy, indigenous rights, LGBT community rights, etc. And all the fear that the new president will become the next Hugo Chavez, which promise of left-wing rhetoric, but reality will be high unemployment, evaporating pension funds, social unrest, and empty grocery stores. Declared the only way to ensure a stable future was to stick to the right-wing neoliberal policy, which is absurd, and has materialized under right-wing governments as well in the past. And the problem was that the Mapuche people and the autonomous movement are right when they point out 9 times out of 10 when they point out something that is considered right wing or fascist, 9 times out of 10 they're right. And so it's like we have to be careful what the generic government is gonna do, because like I said, even with the most revolutionary politics, if you have hierarchical centralized state power, it will not fill the needs of the people, and we will do the same mistake as Lenin did, and Mao did, and Stalin, and Trotsky, and literally every Marxist the country established ever. And even those clandestine groups like the Shiny Path, Macheteros, the Weather Underground, and the Symbionese Liberation Army and the Red Army, the German and Japanese Red Army. You know, the like I said, you have to be careful what you wish for. To truly be revolutionary, has to be decentralized, horizontal, no hierarchy involved. Next one from an article by Crying Eek again, and written in 2019, which is after the insurrection in Nicaragua, and there was an uprising. A year passed and the uprising threatened the government of Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, a largely left uprising against the normally socialist government. Today, as the U.S. government seeks to promote a civil war in Venezuela in order to expand its sphere of political and economic interests, the question raised by the Nicaraguan insurrection are more pressing than ever. What should people do to oppose both Maduro's authoritarian version of socialism and Cuadillo's authoritarian version of democracy? Does anti-imperialism just mean supporting government connected to rival empires like Russia and China? What about the Sandinistas, feminists, indigenous people, environmentalists, student and campesinos movement who oppose Ortega? What about Venezuelan socialists and anarchists who oppose Maduro? At the same time, what does it mean when both neoliberal U.S. politicians and the Zapatistas support a protest movement in Nicaragua? What does it mean when anarchists, communists, and the U.S. military all support the experiment in Rojava, but completely different agendas? How do we support movements like the one who oppose the Ortega government in Nicaragua without simply providing over to capitalists to manipulate social movements into opening up new markets? How do we ensure that anti-authoritarian movements are not exploited as a way to install new authorities? How do we strategize to resist reactionary forces inside the popular movement without sabotaging the movement themselves? For years, we have corresponded with anarchists and grassroots organizations in Venezuela, Nicaragua, and other parts in the Spanish-speaking world, and who describe situations that sound a lot like ones that poor people and people of color face in more explicit capitalist countries. Despite the supposed socialist agenda of the preceding governments, while some of the participants residents in the Maduro and Ortega regime are clearly motivated by the desire to profit on the introduction of the event more oppressive economic policies, and by legitimate grievance of the real desire for equality and self-determination, just like those who rose against the Brazilian government under Dilma Rousseff in 2013, or the people of the Rosa in Ferguson in 2014 under the Obama administration. If the international revolutionary movement do not offer the poor and desperate opportunity to fight for liberation from all forms of state oppression, some of them will end up naively enlisting in uprising orchestrated by neoliberals. We have to build powerful movements and do not legitimize any foreign capitalism or state power. Otherwise, we'll be forever forced to choose the lesser two evils. They're still both evil, so why choose any of them? This is a report by Miranda de las Calles and Mark Alexander. A year since the insurrection. It's been a long year since the popular uprising in Nicaragua. In April 2018, following years of corruption, authoritarianism, nepotism, economic violence, environmental destruction perpetrated by Daniel Ortega, government people took streets in a way not seen in Nicaragua since 1979. The uprising was led by students, workers, feminists, campesinos, and indigenous people from a variety of economic, social, and political backgrounds. The main demand here for Ortega to resign to allow new democratic possibilities, including educational autonomy, participatory democracy, and radically new jurisdictional system, and to offer reparation for all the violence perpetrated by the state, the police, and paramilitary forces. A year later, the government continues to utilize violence against the Nicaraguan people. Independent media outlets have been forced into exile, human rights organizations have stopped operating, and all dialogue and meditation has failed. In the final report, we go over some of the historical context with the Nicaraguan uprising and present the update of the situation that it stands today. In part because of the history of conflict between the state and the people in the Caribbean, there's a long-standing tradition of autonomous activism in the Caribbean region. Community activists have worked outside of the structure of the state to combat issues such as state-sanctioned sexual violence against young girls and women in various sources and economic colonialism. A brief history of the region can show the roots of the tendency towards self-organized community activism and direct action on the Caribbean side. The Spanish Empire colonized the Pacific region of Nicaragua, while the Caribbean was set up as a protectorate of the British Empire, which colonized in a different way. There are multiple ethnic cultural differences between the two regions, as well as 96% of the people of the Pacific area relatively homogenized mestizo and speak Spanish. The Caribbean is populated by multi-ethnic groups, Mosquitos, Afro-Caribbeans, Garifunas, Sumu, Raba, and others speaking multiple languages. In 1894, with the assistance of the United States, Jose Santos Zelaya, the president from Nicaragua, annexed the Caribbean coast. The state branded the annexation as a reincorporation. However, people at the coast still refer to it as an overthrow. This is the origin of the long-standing struggle pitting indigenous and black people of the Caribbean against the Nicaraguan state to reaffirm their right to ancestral land. A few notable examples of the autonomous movement is, for one, in 2009, in opposition to the Nicaraguan government, nearly 1,000 people organized by community activities in Bluefield to occupy over 860 acres of communal land in which to grow their own food and build dignified housing. This was the birth of the Back to Land movement. In April of the same year, indigenous people from the Caribbean declared independence from the state due to racism, poverty, hunger, land colonization. They asserted they had enough will and ability to govern themselves for the well-being of their own community. Mestizo land colonization is the biggest crisis facing black and indigenous community in the Caribbean. Some people had armed themselves and resorted to insurrectionary direct action to protect themselves from the threat. So, the Ortega government response to the spontaneous rebellion in Nicaragua has been similar to strategies that have been utilized against the indigenous and black people of the Caribbean for decades. The strategy includes the arbitrary use of state violence against anyone the state considers to be a threat, mass surveillance, increased police and military presence, and the criminalization of community activity, basically no anarchism. For the people of the Caribbean, the experience of militarization was the continuous standing for many decades without much change, as capitalists has used the police and military to secure their interests in the Caribbean region. The state has used the war on drugs to justify the legitimacy and the militarization. In spite of Ortega's anti-imperialist rhetoric, his government has worked closely with the Drug Enforcement Agency to advance the racist war on drugs. Ortega also worked with ICE to implement U.S. anti-immigration policies. In 1987, Nicaragua signed and established two autonomous regions of the Caribbean coast, the North Caribbean Coast Autonomous Region and the Southern Caribbean Autonomous Region. However, the autonomy law has little effect in practice. Today, black and indigenous communities have been under attack by settlers that had taken over communal lands. The colonos, which mostly mestizo ranchers, have been attacked and kidnapping people. Many people on the coast believe the Ortega government is offering the colonos lucrative loans, assisting them in illegally purchasing the land in order to establish control in the region. Large plots of indigenous communal land are being occupied and used to raise cattle. This has inflicted the devastating impact of the people and the environment. Most blatant illustration of the Ortega's government contempt to the people of the Caribbean is his proposal to build an environmentally devastating canal that would displace thousands of black and indigenous people. The state had determined that struggle for communal land rights and indigenous and black self-determination are contrary to security goals of the mestizo Nicaragua state. Consequently, black and indigenous people are stigmatized as criminal drug dealers. At the same time, those who rebel on or demonstrated any form of solidarity with April 18 rebellion are stigmatized with the label of terrorists and golpistas, or the plotters of the coup. The government's war on drugs has been propelling the country toward mass incarceration. During his tenure, the Nicaraguan prison population has seen one of the sharpest increases in the world. From 2007 to 2018, the prison population more than doubled, increasing from 119 to 276 prisoners per 100,000 of the national population. Black people are disproportionately represented among the prison population. In Bluefield, for example, over half of the prisoner population is black, although black people represent only a quarter of the total population. Most of the Nicaraguan prisons are operated at more than double the capacity, and Ortega's solution of the issue is of overcrowded prisons has been to build more prisons using funds seized from the drug world. So at the moment, there are 62,000 Nicaraguans in exiles who have sought refuge in Costa Rica, living in precarious conditions and facing local xenophobia. And Nicaraguans in California have been creating solidarity and support infrastructure for the best of their abilities. In response, the government has created a new program offering safe return to refugees, but nobody trusts this program. One student returned from the island was immediately arrested in Managua. And a Chris isolated regime, interdisciplinary groups, independent expert produced a 400-plus page report based on the evidence and testimony of the group in Nicaragua concluded that the Ortega government committed crimes against humanity. This claim is supported by the Organization of the American States, the UN, and European Union. This report further isolates Ortega from the rest of the world in Latin America. Ortega is only supported by the government of Cuba and Venezuela. Ortega was virtually no allies in Europe, and many European countries had cut ties with Nicaragua. This has legitimized the advance of protest movements, and the international scale has isolated the Ortega's government. There's the Nica Arc, The government passed this law in December 2018 with bipartisan support. This act completely changed the relationship between the Nicaragua and United States. The United States applied direct sanction to government officials and the Ortega family. Slowly, the diplomatic relation in Nicaragua would rupture, leading to more economic instability and sanction. Unfortunately, many Nicaraguan people dependent on foreign aid with funded hospitals and clinics that will now face economic uncertainty that has been compared to an embargo, while also affecting Nicaragua's diplomatic and economic relation with other countries. The bourgeois were also affected by this act. We also have our best friends, the Zapatistas, who had their solidarity from the Consejo Indígena de Gobierno. The Zapatistas extended their solidarity and support to the people of Nicaragua in a meeting at the Second General Assembly with the campesino leader Francisca Ramirez from Nicaragua. The Zapatistas stated that Ortega had betrayed the ideals of the Sandinista revolution because people forget the inspiration the Sandinista made by Augusto Sandino, who was an anarchist who successfully kicked out the U.S. military in Nicaragua. So remember that. There's also the Civic Alliance in February 2019. That was the first time the government had been willing to negotiate. This new attempt generated growing frustration with the lack of accountability and response by the government, but also the soft approach of Civic Alliance. It's largely tied to the capitalist class, and not a single woman has seen or either on either side of the negotiable table. And the negotiation has slowed down. The government has not met many deadlines that have been established. The first agreement to release all political prisoners happened to open the process of democratization. It is focusing on electoral reforms and speeding on the 2021 elections. And also, the political prisoners, they're giving hope for more liberations, holding and the government holding the prisoners hostage for currency for negotiation. Over 500 political prisoners remain in custody, and the government will release all political prisoners within a 90-day period, but that didn't happen. Several political prisoners organized protests inside the prison by escaping the rules of the prison building, dancing, chanting, and constructing barricades inside the prison. Police had used tear gas and rubber bullets to suppress the protests. And even with the new socialist president coming on, they still doing certain colonialism against the indigenous people, and they still have political prisoners in Nicaragua, even though the political prisoners in question are more leftist than the leftist president and government. Lastly, let's talk about Venezuela. There was an analysis by Sean Hatting, who made an article in 2012 analyzing Hugo Chavez's government, and this was written a year before he died, and analyzing Venezuela and the Bolivian Revolution. Is it a real revolution or smoke and mirrors? So let's talk about. For many people on the left, within and outside Southern Africa, and basically the world, Bolivian revolution see as a beacon of socialist hope in the sea of capitalist despair. The reason why many leftists feel so strongly attached to the project promoted as an alternative because they account the view as a more by Venezuelan state toward create a genuine free form of socialism. At the very least, experiment that properly breaks with the tendency of liberalism. Many articles have therefore been written largely the state nationalization of some industries, land distribution, etc. And to be honest, let's get to the point. We question this assumption. To create a free socialist egalitarian, it's not a transitional phase to socialism, rather it's a capitalist country where the private sector and important state-owned companies seek to maximize profit. Indeed, it will argue that while some welfare is handed out by the state, this often sits by the side with other policies that are outright neoliberal. In order to make the argument that Venezuela cannot be considered as heading in a socialist direction, this article will engage in some issues around the state nationalization progress related to multinational corporations, its community council projects, social service programs, etc. So, there is no doubt that the supporters of the Bolivian Revolution feel passionate about the figure Hugo Chavez and place him firmly in the center of the revolution. There are many people commenting on the versus to go beyond Chavez and the state rhetoric, examine the actual practice of the state and real conditions of workers and the poor. Part of the reason why focus tended to heap on what Chavez says, not so much what the state does or doesn't do, is his charisma. It is a great orator who has the ability to arouse strong emotion among the audience they address. Only one has to think the mass rally had taken place. The fact that Chavez and the rhetoric he used looms large contribute to the situation with the actual condition of Venezuela are often not critically examined. As a result, much of the analysis tend to be relatively shallow. In terms of the Bolivarian revolution, it's often defended in polemic terms on the left and demonized on the right. With reality, the facts sometimes have a little impact. People ignore the pieces of paper is a right-wing opponents. For them, reality, their ruling class, including Venezuelan capitalists, continue to enjoy, and their lifestyle is simply ignored. Rather than focus solely on the socialist anti-imperialist rhetoric of Chavez, for right-wing opponents, Chavez has become seen as a devil incarnate, a man who is supposedly hell-bent on destroying capitalism and impose authoritarian dictatorship. At times, Chavez is even compared to Hitler by conservative opponents. When one nevertheless rationally look at Chavez's regime, we cannot in all honesty be successfully arguing that it is a totalitarian dictatorship. It will be highlighted later, but its tendency with regard to many of the actions of the state, mostly directed at the workers and the poor. But Venezuela is still a bourgeois representative democracy. It's not limited to right real party supporters, especially international, and they often unfortunately accepted the message from Chavez, despite it's not a socialist. It's become a meme at this point called Vuvuzuela Socialism back in 2016 YouTube. And let's talk about the minority property owners. The Constitution does not include doesn't include clause that on paper commit the state to protect and further the rights of people. Communities in the environment with little dystopia, there are also clauses that pay lip service to the idea of participatory democracy and the full development of human rights. Essentially also promote the role of state with the economy that will argue that later however does amount to socialism. Important section of the Bolivian Constitution also enshrine the protection of minority property, including state ownership and private property. The implication should not be disregarded. By protecting and recognizing the right of minority to own most of the property. The Bolivian Constitution also commits the state to uphold the unequal relations that do flow from this. Unequal power relations are based off a class society. For anarchists, the ruling class considers two sections: capitalists and state managers who monopolize wealth and power. As such, state managers derive most of their power by controlling the means of administration and coercion. And while capitalist source of power rests largely about directly owning the means of production for which private property rights are essential, indeed, as long as been recognized by anarchists that minority property rights, whether based on private property or state ownership, are one of the main foundations on which capitalist system rests. And every country in the world right now use Lenin-style state capitalism because it's capitalism in its final form, pretty much. Property rights generally maintain the class defined by the situation where the elite own most of the property, while the majority has little or nothing. The fact that the elite few have a monopoly protected by the state over the ownership of the means of production also allows them to exercise power over the majority, who by design have very little as such property right, creating interest and process whereby those who do not own property are always at disadvantage and are forced in order to survive in their labor to those who do own property. And the property rights allow for the wage slavery, exploitation, authoritarian relationship to define capitalism. Despite some of the nice things the Constitution is very hard for its protection of private and minority property ownership, yet French relationship based on inequality and subjugation of the majority of the people. Look at the three documentaries of Venezuela. Despite some of them are very pro-Chavez and the other very anti-Chavez, they all share the same topic, and they all point out the same problem, but they never want to talk about documentaries. For example, like Venezuela Bolivariana, Pueblo y Lucha de la Cuarta Guerra Mundial, or the other one, Viva Venezuela, Fighting for Socialism, or the very anti-Chavez documentary that I also recommend, Chavismo, the Plague of the 21st Century. They all just forget that capitalism is Venezuela is capitalism, very profit driven, and it's very neoliberal in nature. While the pro-Chavez documentary often forget that Venezuela is not socialism, it's not fighting for socialism, it's fighting for capitalism. And the and the anti-Chavez documentary forget that the government is capitalism, but they're using socialist rhetoric. You have to acknowledge, no matter how revolutionary the politics, we can never support the state. Full stop. Even if we want to for pragmatic reasons, like for example the situation in Ukraine, we cannot forget that the state is against the people by principle. And we need to help the people based on decentralized horizontal struggle, because that is how human have functioned for 95% of its existence.